Welcome back, MTG Joe here. Today we're doing another installment of the weekly meta breakdown where we look at the top performing decks on the MTG Arena ladder. Today's video is for standard best of 3, traditional standard. If you're looking for the best decks and best of 1, the video's in the playlist. We'll cover the other formats in the upcoming days as well. I'm just going to put it out there for this week's videos just in case people are catching it, but I'm going to shift the content of the channel slightly to focus less on kind of pushing for Mythic, a little bit less gameplay, more content in terms of informative stuff. So continue with the meta breakdowns. I did a sideboard guide for best of 3 standard mono red aggro. I'm going to continue and put out sideboard guides for all the popular standard decks and then look to do for explore and historic as well. So something to expect in the near future. And then just kind of informative guides, stuff of that nature, as opposed, I don't have as much time to really play the ladder at this point, so going to focus less on that for my own sanity and focus more on just providing a breadth of useful content. So as always, we get the data from UntappedGG, companion tool that runs alongside Arena's client, aggregates your win rates with others. A lot of cool data can be found here. Link is in the video description if you want to use Untapped to track your games. And then I will paste all the deck lists as always, so you can always copy paste, timestamps away, all those goodies. So I'm going to start with the meta. I can kind of look at the popularity of decks. Again, popular deck doesn't necessarily correlate to highest win rate deck, and we'll kind of see that today as we go through the decks. One thing to keep in mind, it's beginning of the month, so we're doing Platinum to Mythic. As we progress throughout the month, we shift the parameters to Diamond to Mythic and then Mythic only. Because everybody reset, we like to kind of take it from there. So, popularity of the day, and Golgari Midrange is still hovering at the top most played deck at 18%. Which is kind of interesting because we'll see in the stats, it's actually one of the lower win rate decks, but people are just loving this deck. The second most popular deck, 4-color Control, is probably one of its worst matchups, and being that it's still very popular is something to kind of consider with that. Surprisingly, we see Mono Red kind of creep up this week at 8%. This is the deck that I'm going to be playing in an upcoming tournament. I'm picking it up in paper for upcoming RCQs, and like I said, I put together an initial sideboard guide as I'm learning the deck. There's a lot of kind of configurations in terms of some of the exact numbers. While there's core cards or Kumanos or Swiss Spear, stuff like that, certain cards are seeing varied numbers, as well as the sideboard configurations are all over the place. So kind of figuring out what the best sideboard is for that. We have Azorius Soldiers, Esper Legends, Bant Control, all around the 5 to 6% range. Sultai Control at 4%, and then Esper Control at 3.7%. So you can see like big kind of jump over like the last month and a half. Golgari started at 10, peaks around 20, drops down to 11, and then seeing an increase again. The ramp deck really had kind of a rise around the time of the World Championship. Was in the like 5%, and now we're seeing it, peak at 15 or 17 actually, around the time Reed was playing it, Reed Duke. Mono Red, interesting enough, we see it kind of decline. It actually peaked earlier on at about 12.6. Obviously a much more popular, better best of 1 deck, but I think against like these ramp decks, it's got a pretty good matchup. You can kind of build it in a way to beat the creature decks by just shifting into like reddish control. I've been enjoying the deck. I'm learning the deck and kind of the nuances with it. Nothing else is too big in terms of significance of jumps. Kind of looking at, again, Platinum to Mythic rank, October 2nd to the 9th, and 29,000 games of Magic played. And we're going to look at it. Aforementioned 4-color Control at we're going to round it and say the nicest win rate possible, 69%. And this is pretty much the list from Reed from the championship, I believe. The only variance I think is Ossification over Go for the Throats, which could be different, but kind of catch-all. Ossification very useful in certain matchups, but it's actually worse into this type of deck. Like in the mirror, it's worse because they can Leyline Binding your Ossifications, where the Go for the Throats are a hard removal spell for your opponent's Atraxis. The briefcases allow you to kind of ramp up into like an earlier Sunfall or bigger spell, and then beans are all the rage in Eternal formats right now, and seeing play in Standard just turns all your like 5-drops. So Sunfall now draws a card, Leyline Binding for 1 mana, exiles whatever you want, and then draws a card. Herd Migration makes you a bunch of tokens, draws a card. Atraxa, finally making this Atraxa card playable. Now you could draw 7 cards instead of 6. Virtue is also just used in the for the more aggressive matchups. You have this access. Now you'll notice this version's still on heavier green-white. I've seen some of the versions go upwards of 4 swamps. It depends on the configuration. But with this version, you're seeing the Rafine's Tower, as well as the Atoras in some numbers. This is going to give you access to a number of black spell lands on turn 2, which allow you to cast Virtue. The sideboard's seen a little bit of a change. Full 4 of Disdainful Stroke for the mirror, Ossification in here, just more removal. The Sunset Revelries is kind of a concession to the aggressive red decks. Just helps kind of creates 2 blockers, buys you some time, and gains you some life. Really don't like to see that from the mono red side. Interesting, you see the Archangel is a split 3-1 as opposed to 4 in the main. Similarly, the Sunfall 3-1 from Host Seed Shark when they kind of take out removal, and then the anti-counter package. This deck is very soft to blue-based counters, so Thruns and Tyrannix Rex, nice additions out of the sideboard. We'll then move to Azorius Soldiers, and this is Simon Nielsen's list, and this is kind of a tempo flash-oriented version of the deck, as opposed to linear aggro. You'll notice no 2-drop Lord. Instead, it's really about kind of flashing in threats, resolute reinforcements. You can protect your stuff and buy them back with Zephyr Sentinel, reset it like that. The Werefox is flashed removal. Also happens to be not a soldier. Elf Fox Knight, all the other types. Classic Elf Fox Knight. You see the elf in it right away. Virtues of Loyalty in here, Wedding Announcements. So a little bit more kind of think Azorius mid-range tempo aggro buzzword soup. You still have like Lunar Veteran's actually pretty good because it gains you a bunch of life for the aggressive matchups. Recruitment Officer for card advantage. Knight of Errant of Eos is card advantage. Cool line is you cast your Knight Errant, get 2 cards, and then you cast Zephyr Sentinel, bounce the Knight Errant, and then get to cast it again. So just sustain card advantage. This deck also has a lot of utility lands in the form of Fortified Beachhead and Myrex, as well as 2 of each of the channel lands. Sideboard, you just have a bunch of removal, Elspeth's Smite, Destroy Evil, Lantern Flare, more counters for the big mana decks. Toski is welcome for the heavy removal decks to provide you card advantage. Another Werefox is Catch-All. Notably with Werefox, something to point out, it's not like the Brutal Cathar, Skyclave Apparition style effects, where it mentions your opponent's creature. You can actually exile your own card under Werefox. So a line that you can do is, for example, if they're going to Sunfall you, you can protect one of your creatures and then have Werefox die, but at least you get your creature back. So it's a way to kind of protect that might be able to sneak you through some damage. So it's kind of a virtual haste, or you could just flash it in on end step. Similarly, Wandering Emperor for the heavy removal matchups, just a way to kind of get around Sunfalls, Farewells, stuff of that nature. Moving on, Mono Red Aggro. So there's a lot of different configurations of the list. This is fairly similar to the main board I am playing. The one notable, I'm not on the full 4 Mishra's Foundry. I think this is too many Mishra's Foundries. You have too many 1-drops. I'm actually experimenting between 2 and 3 at this point. I'm also playing around with the 22 versus 23 line count. I think ultimately I do want to be on 23, but I'm going to do a couple more games to see. Now, this version here, what kind of drew it to me was the interaction package. While you still have your Play with Fires and your Lightning Strikes, notably Play with Fire, while good against the Azorius Soldiers deck, not great necessarily against the Legends decks or 4-color, or even to some extent the Golgari Midrange decks. We're having the Warcraftings and Frenzies kind of scale up, hit bigger things. Warcrafting is also some card advantage. Again, I'm trying out the 4. I'm also playing around with some numbers in terms of, do we want Witchstalker? So Witchstalker in a vacuum is probably more efficient with this deck because you could cast it for reduced cost. However, the Warcrafting has some advantage because you can cast it with the Bloodthirsty Adversary. So this is something you could flash back, whereas the Frenzy, because it's 4 CMC as a base cost, you cannot flash it back. A card like Feldon, very good in the best of 1 format because you're playing a lot more mono red mirrors. But if we look at this first few decks, a lot of their removal is like Go for the Throats or exile-based removal for the most part. I think Feldon at 1 copy is ideal for this type of format. And then the utility of Charming Scoundrel to kind of loot, give you Wicked tokens, whatever it is, has a lot more value. 2 Phoenix Chicks felt good. The Monstrous Rage, I think 2 of is a suitable amount. The one thing, like as we kind of play at games, if we do notice an increase in the number of like humans or soldiers or mono red mirrors, then this number of play with fires would come up. And then we would kind of reduce on the cost of this, kind of hedging with that. But I do think the biggest thing here, Mishra's Foundry. So this sideboard's different than mine. I do like the Koths. I have the Lithomantic Barrages, but personally, I don't like the Invasion of Tarkirs necessarily. 2 damage, but like I would just rather play with fires. Obliterating Bolt's also nice because it could come in against the ramp decks and hit any other 4 drops or 4 toughness creatures, which is useful. They sometimes they'll have Baloth on the side. They have Archangel, get through blockers, stuff like that. Adeline, stuff of that nature. Rafine can be hit. Furnace Punisher, I actually really don't like. I know people always put this in, and it's kind of got that Punisher effect, but the kind of core deck you'd think this would be good against in the Domain deck plays so many basics that it's not really that impactful. Golgari usually has a number of basics, the Humans deck, stuff of that nature, and it kind of plays you further into sweepers. 3 mana doesn't impact the board the turn it comes down. It's just largely, I don't enjoy it. I prefer the Planeswalker package, and then I'm playing the Forge. So I prefer the Forge much more, just giving you reoccurring attackers to come through. So I'll link to my sideboard guide as well, so in the comments, so if you want to take a look at that. I'm still working on the deck as we kind of lead up. The tournament's on the 22nd, so some revisions as we kind of come across. We then go to Esper Legends. This was the World Championship list, and the biggest thing to just be mindful. So it's a 1 disappear, 3 go for the throats, but this deck's largely been the same since the last set. Skrelv into Thalia, Ardenic into Rafine, very powerful. A notable change is Lord Skitter is taking the place of Adeline, just having incidental graveyard hate, as well as making the token each turn without having to attack. While the tokens can't block, you don't necessarily need to do a ill-advised attack. And then this plays really nice with Rafine, just helping you survey or kind of connive further into your deck. Sideboard, you have just more removal for the aggressive decks, Surges, Disdainful Strokes, Blot Out just to deal with bigger things, the Wedding Announcement package, as well as AO for the non-exile removal based decks. This deck hasn't really changed too much, so I'm not going to go too deep into it. Like, I actually did a sideboard guide like a while ago on this one, so if you're interested, it's up on my channel as well. So I'll link that one as well if you're interested. And then we go to Mono White Humans, 58.6%. Another deck that does very well in Best of 1. We see it now kind of being ported over to Best of 3. Kind of your tax effects, Thalias. You've got the human sub-theme that we see similar into the Pioneer format. Coppercoat Vanguard, Hopeful Initiate. The card that's seeing play a little bit more, Spellbook Vendor. Just kind of buffing each team of your team members. Kind of the Luminarch Aspirant style effect. The Scry is actually really relevant at times, just setting up your draws, letting you attack in. Peacekeeper is tax, Extraction Specialist for the heavy removal. You can get stuff back. Full Adelins, notably no Brutal Cathars. Kind of weak into a format with like heavy removal that you really don't want to give your opponent their effective ETB stack. And then Virtue of Loyalty on the top end. Now this deck is another one that's playing full 4 of Mishras. I think the Mishra is fine as a 4 of in this deck because like against the mono red deck, we could see the curve just being a lot heavier in terms of 1-drops. So you're often wanting to double spell on turn 2, whereas this you're most of the time playing out one of these 2-drops where it's not as meaningful in terms of having white on turn 2. Sideboard's really clean. I really like the sideboard. Lay down arms, catch-all removal for creatures that scales late game. Destroy evil for bigger things or enchantments. Invasion of Gobukan is kind of a tax effect. Wedding Announcement for heavy removal, and then Wandering Emperor against like sweepers and stuff. We have Greg Orange's Bant Control deck from Worlds as well. So basically blue-white control with beans. Draws a bunch of cards, kind of a cool interaction is you can overcast March of Otherworldly Light as well as Syncopate for more mana than needed to trigger the beans. Draws you some cards that way. Broker's Charm as card draw at instant speed, destroying enchantments, or a fight later on, or like deals damage. You have like Whale as a way to deal damage, or like your Wandering Emperor Sunfall tokens. Leyline Binding in this deck is a cheap spell, with enabled from the Triomes as well. Sideboard's basically situational counters, situational removals based on the matchup. And then in the heavy kind of counterspell mirrors, you have Shrimp Hands, Hullbreaker Whore as well. Memory Deluge as well, just for the kind of the grindier matchups. And then lastly, the most popular deck is the lowest win rate of decks we'll feature today. Everything else that was on the list was sub 55, and I usually keep 55 as kind of the benchmark in terms of consistency. So the deck's kind of a black-based deck that's splashing green for a number of cards. Yeah, splashing might be a little loose. It's a mix, but Mosswood Dread Knight's really the card that's suggesting that people branch out from black. This card is card draw. It's a recursive threat, and it kind of incentivizes your opponent to not kill it because they can just recast it. Plus, really much a pain in the creature mirrors. Also, notably, can blow up a lot of these enchantments we've been seeing, stuff like Leyline Binding of that nature. Tortoise kind of ramps you, gives you some abilities with the creature lines to both reduce their cost as well as give them extra power. Helps you get up to your Nissas or Virtue hardcasts. Shieldreds, Liliana's kind of mixed into here. Hand Hate with Duress. A lot of different removal spells between Cut Down, Go for the Throat, Shieldred's Edict, Terra Sunder. We're seeing a 1-of Outland Liberator in the main. That's kind of a way to deal with more of these creature lines. Kind of a cool interaction. You can just like Field of Ruin repeatedly with Blossoming Tortoise. So the decks that are a little bit greedier on mana, you can just keep, every turn, ideally attack with Tortoise, get back Field of Ruin, blow up something with Field of Ruin, get it back. This sideboard's going to be looking at stuff like Cut Down, so just more removal, more Hand Hate, stuff of that nature. Path to Peril for the more aggressive matchups. Phyrexian Arena for the grindier matchups. The End, as well as Shieldred. Shieldred, a useful card in the Leyline Binding matchups, big mana decks, or heavy sweeper based matchups. But the notable thing with this deck is you have no way to stop a Atraxa or a Tali or just the big spells on the stack. So you have a little bit of an issue there. You have to really attack their hand to prevent them from casting it. So that's it for the week. Let me know what you think, and we will catch you next time. Thanks for watching.